Good morning. Can you all hear me? No? How about now? Really not? Okay. All right. Great. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I really want to thank Sandra and Mark and Howard, who's here in spirit. And it's just so gratifying to see all of you here interested in all these topics that we're going to touch on. Okay, so maybe this is the wrong crowd. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but why should educators care about the brain? Well, we can think about this lovely car. I forget what kind of car it is. Someone is going to tell me, I'm sure. And we can think about how you can enjoy driving this car. You can take it all over the place. And you don't necessarily need to know anything about how it works, right? As long as it's working well. Well, what happens if it's not working well? Well, then you need to get under the hood and figure out a little bit more about what's going on. And I would say that, there are times when our critical thinking skills, or our students' critical thinking skills, are not up to par, might need some fine-tuning, and this is a time when learning more about the brain can actually help. I'll go for another analogy here, and this is an aerial view of the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, where I live now, even though I'm originally Canadian, and it's really nice to be home. And so, there was a paper written back in 1997 by John Brewer, who's now one of the biggest supporters of neuroscience in education. He funds my research and many others. But back in the time, 1997, he said that education in the brain, it was a bridge too far. Really, really hard. And this is a close-up view. And as you can see, there is actually a bridge between neuroscience and education. And it goes through Treasure Island along the Bay Bridge there. And that bridge, I would maintain, the stopover between education and neuroscience is cognitive psychology, or one could argue psychology more generally. And so this is an analogy I've just given you, and you've managed to understand in a very short period of time all of these relationships here between San Francisco and Berkeley and Treasure Island, and education, neuroscience, cognitive psychology. And you've managed to glean the relation between those relations, which is that we're talking here about intermediaries, okay? So that's a form of analogical reasoning that supports learning. I've just taught you something new, hopefully, by using analogical reasoning. Okay. So here's another form of reasoning. This is transitive inference. This is a task that we've used in a couple of our functional MRI or fMRI studies. So let's say here that what I have here are a number of premises. Right, I can't point to my own thing here. So here we have a number of premises, okay? I'm telling you that the green ball is heavier than the yellow ball, the blue and red balls are equally heavy, et cetera, et cetera. Then I'm asking you, which of these two balls is heavier? You can shout it out. Green, okay, fantastic. That was pretty easy, right? All you had to do was look up this one relation and figure that out. What if I change that ball to purple? Which one's heavier, yellow or purple? Okay, so if I were measuring your response times, I would say that that was slower. And if I were measuring your brain function, I would say that there are parts of the brain that are really important for reasoning that were actually more active when you were doing this one than the one before. So that's exactly the kind of study that we do. So what you had to do on that one there was to integrate those two relations. And I just shown you now two examples where you have to think about relations between items and then think about relations between these relations, essentially. And here's a third example. This is Raven's progressive matrices. Something like it appears on most IQ tests. Okay? And the idea here is that you have to think about the relations between the items in the horizontal and the vertical axes, and then you have to try to glean those relations in order to integrate them to solve for the missing puzzle, the missing clue, right? So all of these are forms of relational reasoning. As I said here, they're central to concepts of IQ. We're not going to get into IQ, anyway, we can talk more about that later. But, okay, so all of these have this same form, this hierarchical structure of individual relations that you have to think about and extract from there a second-order relation. And that's a task we call relational integration. So my lab has been studying that for quite a while now, and we think it's absolutely central to human cognition. All right, so tests of relational reasoning, as I said, require the joint consideration of previously separate mental relations. All right. Now, I think about reasoning as supporting the proximal zone of development. Whatever new thing you're trying to learn, reasoning supports the acquisition of those new skills. And this is true in language, math, sciences, you name it. And so this is the way I think about it. We have relational reasoning capacity that's growing over age, growing over child development. And let's say that you're in preschool and you're trying to understand basic numeracy, basic understanding of quantities. Which one of these two has more? You're engaging in low-level, first-order relational thinking there. And so your current reasoning ability is scaffolding the development of your number line, your mental number line. Let's say that you're in grade 4 and you're trying to understand fractions. This, I would submit to you, is a form of second-order relational reasoning. This is essentially an analogy here, comparing these two fractions. Then we have pre-algebra, right around grade 6 or thereabouts. I don't know. I don't remember when I learned this in Canada. And then, grade 8, we start to come into more complex algebra. And, algebra is a real stepping stone to careers in science, technology, education, mathematics, STEM. And that's kind of a stumbling block for a lot of kids. And before that, fraction understanding is a stumbling block. And I would argue that better supporting reasoning ability will help to improve all of this. Okay, so this is my lab at Berkeley. And we're called the Building Blocks of Cognition Lab because we like to drill down into specific parts of cognition that support high-level abilities like reasoning. And these are some of the questions that motivate our research. What brain mechanisms underlie reasoning? How and why does reasoning ability develop in childhood? Why are some people better at it than others? Is it possible to improve at it? Sure, you can learn strategies, tricks to solve specific tasks, but can we actually strengthen general cognitive skills by strengthening the underlying brain mechanisms? If so, can reasoning training boost school performance? Could it help children recover from brain injury or learning disabilities more generally? Okay, so our lab takes multiple approaches. I won't have time today to talk to you about all of them, but essentially we're taking lots of different approaches to try to understand reasoning. All right, and so this slide represents something like 10 years of research in my lab, where we took all these different kinds of reasoning tasks, like you see here, and more, and tried to figure out what do they have in common in terms of how they engage the brain. And we found a common underlying brain network that supports this hierarchy. And these are the brain areas that are active again and again across all of these different kinds of tasks. One of them is called the inferior parietal lobule, IPL. Let's just call it parietal cortex, although it is a very specific part of it. And we found that across many different kinds of tasks, whether you're thinking about relationships between objects in the real world or visuospatial relationships, this is behind that, this is to the left, this is heavier, blah, blah, blah. This area is involved in keeping those in mind. And we found that this other area, also a mouthful of a name, rostrolateral prefrontal cortex. Anyway, let's just call it prefrontal cortex for today, but it's a specific part of it. And it's involved, it works very closely with this parietal region to integrate several different relations. And so these areas, as I said, are strongly interconnected. And this connection doesn't exist in macaque monkeys. It may not exist in any other primates, but it exists in humans. We, other people have just discovered that recently, and we think it's because that it's one of the reasons for the emergence of higher level cognition. All right, so we've undertaken a large study looking at the neural basis of reasoning development, and the study was called NORA, the Brain Explorer, Neurodevelopment of Reasoning Ability. And I really want to thank here Emilio Ferrer, who's a quantitative psychologist, Carter Wendelkin, a research scientist, and Kirsty Whitaker, who did a lot of the scanning of the kids. And this was a 5-year study of reasoning development that we're still analyzing a lot of the data because it's got a ton of stuff in it. We've been looking at brain structure, various forms of brain structure, various forms of brain function, reasoning skills and other cognitive abilities, and school achievement, particularly interested in math, although we also have reading that we could look at later on. And we've been looking at this in the context of what we know about the children's socioeconomic background, as well as their genetic profile. Now, I will argue that genes play very little of a role here. They just kind of are, slightly tweaking cognitive skills, but the main thing here is really the environment in which the child grows, both at home and at school. Okay, so how have we been measuring reasoning ability in these kids? This is a study of kids, 200 children between the ages of 6 and 18 that we followed over a course of 5 years, essentially. Each child was followed up to 3 times over the span of 3 years. And we have 4 different standardized measures of reasoning ability. And this is, if you take all those together and you have a factor score of these different measures of reasoning, this is how our kids are growing with age. This is going from about age 6 to about age 19 or so. And this is the massive growth of reasoning that you see over that time frame. The red lines represent a time span of about 1.5 years from the first time the kids came in to the second time. And the blue lines represent those children who came back in for a third time, so their change from time 2 to time 3. You can see it's all generally going up. But you do see a lot of individual differences, right? I mean, this is, there's a lot of spread here. You've got, some kids down here that, at age 19 are on par with some 6-year-olds, right? And so we want to understand why, right? So that's what we're studying. So reasoning develops markedly over elementary school here, that really, really large, steep improvement here, but it continues to develop throughout adolescence. All right, and we've been looking at math, as I said, and we've taken several measures in these kids. One is a standardized math fluency test that measures speeded calculation. Another one is a test that measures numerical reasoning. So if I say 2, 4, 6, what's the next number in the sequence? And then a third one is an applied problem subset that measures your ability to solve practical math word problems, okay? Like if you've got 10 cents from your friend and you take it to the grocery store, et cetera, that sort of thing. And so how does this math development relate to reasoning? Well, what we found is that kids and adolescents who showed the biggest improvement in reasoning, the steepest increase over these 3 time points are the ones who showed the best performance at time 3, so 3 years after they started the study, on applied math problems and on math reasoning. Okay, so we can get these early hints of later math development just by looking at this basic reasoning ability. To our surprise, reasoning ability at the very first time point was also a really good predictor of basic math fluency, speeded calculation 3 years later. All of this was true across childhood and adolescence. No matter what age you started at, reasoning was a really good predictor of the math skills that you had 1.5 and 3 years later. Okay, so it matters. This is important stuff. Okay, so what's changing in the brain that can explain the growth of reasoning? So we're looking at brain structure. This is Homer Simpson, where he discovers that he had a crayon stuck in prefrontal cortex. They take it out, he becomes a normal person, so they put it back in. And then this is brain function. This is what we know about the different parts of the brain that are active when he's thinking about sleep or donuts, etc. All right. So what is changing in the brain that could support the growth of reasoning? Well, I think Michelangelo was a phenomenal sculptor, and what he did was he would start with a block of marble, and then he would chip away at it and reveal the underlying form that he already envisioned in there. And the brain develops in much the same way. It gets pruned, it gets fine-tuned over time. And you start out, this is a sculptor named San Mateo. And so we have this sort of fine-tuning of local brain architecture. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So essentially, you can just take a little slice of the brain, and you can see here both the gray matter and the white matter in the outlines here. The gray matter are the neurons, the cell bodies of the neurons, right around the outside of the brain. And then the white in there is those massive white matter connections that explain why the brain is so interconnected. Okay, and then we can zoom in to part of that gray matter, and you can see here a number of neurons there. And so here you have at birth, this is kind of the array of neurons. Then at age 7, you see there are tons and tons of neurons in there, all making connections between them. And then at age 15, again, you see that it's now it's pruned back. Only the best, most efficient connections have been saved. All right? So that's one possible explanation for why reasoning develops, is this pruning process that happens during childhood and adolescence. And actually we have some evidence that supports this. So when we look at different regions that are involved in reasoning, we've got the parietal and this rostrolateral prefrontal region, and also this other area of prefrontal cortex that's important more generally for cognitive skills. They all show cortical thinning with age. They're getting thinner. This is not pathology. This is not some sort of a disease. It's not like in aging, whatever. This is the good thing. This is the thinning that supports the fine-tuning of the local brain architecture. And what we found, moreover, is that the children who show the biggest thinning in these regions, especially in parietal cortex here, that we think is the workhorse of reasoning, the kids who show the biggest thinning over time in these regions are the ones who show the biggest improvements in reasoning. Okay? So brain shrinkage is actually good in childhood. So that was pretty exciting, and it's particularly in parietal cortex, which we think is so important for understanding individual relations. And we actually think that supporting children's ability to think about relations between things could be a really, really good way to help to mature this parietal area. We don't know that for a fact. We're very interested in studying it further, but could really form a solid foundation for future STEM and language and everything else. Okay, so another way in which the brain changes during development, in addition to this fine-tuning, is the strengthening of those long-range white matter pathways that support cognition. So we can strip away this outer gray matter, and this is a beautiful image made with diffusion tensor imaging of all the white matter fibers. They make up like half of the brain or something like that. Half of the brain is just interactions between brain regions. Okay, so these are fibers going in all different directions, and we can zoom in on that, and each fiber is made up of these long connections of neurons. These neurons can have these really, really long projections, and because they're sending electrical signals, those would normally decay. If you send a wire a really long distance, electricity is going to eventually decay, but they have this beautiful wrapping of myelin, this fatty substance that insulates them, that allows these messages to get from one end of the brain to the other very, very quickly. And so we can look at how myelination of the brain supports reasoning. And we can't look at that directly because we can't zoom all the way in here, but we can look at these white matter fibers here and look at how strong those connections are. Okay, and so one of the areas that we've looked at is, of course, this white matter tract that connects the parietal and the frontal cortices. And so if we zoom into this tract, we see that it's getting stronger. This white matter is getting stronger with age. And importantly, the kids who improve the most in reasoning over this developmental time frame are the ones who show the biggest increases in the strength of the white matter. Okay? So white matter maturation is also supporting brain development. And we think that activities that may be reinforcing early brain development could be extremely important for setting a child up on the right trajectory. Okay, good. So another thing that's changing, because these white matter pathways are getting stronger, it means that these brain regions can talk to each other more closely. And so we can measure just how strongly coupled is their activation over time, and we think that that reflects how closely they're talking to each other. Okay? And so we are looking in particular at these prefrontal and parietal regions, and we can measure just how correlated their activity is over time. And we find that better reasoning skills are associated with tighter coupling within this network, and this is particularly true during adolescence. So from age 12 to 18, we find the stronger your network, the better your reasoning ability. And so, it's not enough to say, okay, reasoning skills are basically, they improve a lot during elementary school. No, they're also improving during middle school and high school, and it matters how strongly these regions are interconnected. Now, in addition to looking at brain structure and basically how these areas are interconnected, we also do functional MRI, like with Homer Simpson, to figure out which part of the brain likes to sleep or think about donuts. And so in this case here, what we've done is put up a very simple problem on the board, and I'm going to get some audience participation here because I sense that you guys have had enough about brains for just one moment. And so here, I put up these 4 stimuli on the screen, and I can ask you different questions. The first is there a match in shape between the first 2 items, the first pair of items? Do those 2 match in shape? Good job. All right. What about the bottom 2? Do those match in shape? No. Great. Okay. What about the top 2? Do they match in pattern? Okay. And the bottom 2? Okay. Now, that's fine. Now let's think about the problem as a whole. Do the bottom 2 share the same feature as the top 2? Think about that for a second. So the bottom 2, do they match according to the same dimension as the top 2? Yes, they do. That's right. This is an analogy, basically, right? So you have to look beyond the differences between the top pair and the bottom pair and just think about what they have in common. And so, even though I'm showing you the same 4 simple images at once, I can ask you these 3 different questions. And the first 2 questions ask you to think about individual relations between 2 items. And the third question asks you to think about a second-order relation or relation between relations. Okay? And so we did this task while these 6 to 18-year-olds were lying in the scanner, and we looked at which parts of the brains were active while they were doing that. And these are the parts of the brain that are most active that show a biggest increase in activation for the hard problems versus the easy problems. So when you're engaged in relational integration, it's our old friends, the inferior parietal lobule and the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex. I don't make this up. We get these findings in study after study. It's really quite delightful. And so what do we actually see when we zoom in to this prefrontal region? Well, if we look across ages, now I'm just chunking them for ease, but this is 7 to 10, 11 to 14, 15 to 18. What we see is this area is equally active for the difficult problems. It's active already by the earliest time that we're looking, and it's not changing. But what's happening is that for the easy problems, when you're considering individual relations between items, the shape and the pattern questions, you see a decrease in activation over age. And so essentially, as you get older, you're not sweating the small stuff. Prefrontal cortex doesn't care anymore about these really easy problems. It knows that other parts of the brain can take that on, can solve those problems. Instead, it's focusing on the difficult problems. And so this is an increase in efficiency that we're seeing. And the reason that the frontal cortex can do that is because parietal cortex is getting so good at its job. So the more parietal cortex matures, and the more it interacts closely, kind of checks in with prefrontal cortex, the more prefrontal cortex can, sip margaritas by the beach while a child is doing an easy problem. Okay? This is one of the principles of brain development: is increased efficiency. You don't have to work quite as hard to get the same results. All right. Good. So then we come to the really important question for educators and for society: can reasoning skills improve with practice? Can we show that experience can strengthen these pathways that we've been talking about ad nauseum here? And so our first reasoning training study, this is work by Alison Mackey, who's now a postdoc at MIT. And what we did was we went to a low-income school in Oakland and focused in on 2nd and 3rd graders. We did an 8-week after-school program, and over the course of 8 weeks, children engaged in 15 hours of playing games, card games, board games, Nintendo DS, some computerized games as well, just a mix of things. And we randomly assigned kids to one of 2 different kinds of game play. And the way that we were thinking about this was, let's think about a hierarchy of cognitive skills. Sorry about that, reasoning. But reasoning is a very complex human ability, right? And it depends on many lower-level cognitive skills. One of these is working memory, or the ability to maintain and manipulate information in your head. And so that's one thing. And working memory, or this ability to maintain information, hinges strongly on the ability to have good processing speed, essentially to be able to, essentially shunt information quickly around your brain and think very quickly. And so what we did was we selected a set of games that we thought would potentially tax reasoning skills very strongly, so at the top of this hierarchy, and we selected another set of games that we thought would target rapid processing speed, right? And then the question was, would we see that improving processing speed could improve working memory and improve reasoning, or would we see that improving reasoning, which requires all of this stuff, would actually lead to this kind of trickle-down effect of improving lower-level skills? Who here thinks that a top-down approach would be more effective? Raise your hands. A few people, okay. Who here thinks that a bottom-up approach, really targeting the low-level foundations, would be more effective? Okay, great, so more people. This is a majority here. Well, that's what we set out to test. And so this is an example of one of our reasoning games. Who knows the game Set? Okay, some people, the rest of you, go home and check it out. You can find it online, or you can just buy the card set. Essentially, it's a pretty complex game that kids can get really good at, where you have to consider 4 rules, and actually 8 rules, to be able to find a set of 3 cards that all respect all of the rules. And so they played, this is one of about 30 games that they played, about an hour a day for 2 days a week. And then the other children who were in the speeded cognition games group, they played games like Blink, which is like a really rapid card sorting task where you have to sort cards according to color or shape or number or something like that. And you have to show some flexibility to be able to switch categories. But it doesn't require the same level of relational integration, of thinking about multiple rules that Set does. Okay, and we set this up as 4 15-minute stations, so children in the reasoning group rotated around these 4 different stations, and children in the speed group did the exact same thing. Everybody thought they were having fun, everybody was engaging their minds, thinking they were getting smarter, but we found that these commercially available games, these were not even games that were targeted as brain training games. These were family games that you find at the store. We found that they influence children's cognitive skills, and that they, depending on which games you pick, you have different outcomes. We tested children on multiple standardized cognitive measures before and after this 8-week program. And this is just the basic set of findings that we got. So for the reasoning kids, we showed an improvement on a test of nonverbal intelligence, showed improvements on spatial working memory, an improvement on coding, which is a task that requires you to make mental transformations very quickly. In the speeded games group, we saw no improvements on any of the higher level stuff. All we saw were improvements on 2 lower level processing speed measures. So, you know, it's fine. The strongest effective training were, of course, in the area that we were taxing with our games. But let's look back at our hierarchy here, top down versus bottom up. Oops. Sorry about that animation, but essentially we found that reasoning training led to improvements in working memory and one form of processing speed. So we saw this trickle down, but on the other hand, we didn't see any transfer up from training these foundational skills. Not at all, not at all. Now, if we had a child with a learning disability who has an actual problem with processing speed, it may well be that training that up could get past a roadblock and allow a child then to develop their working memory and reasoning skills. But in these healthy, albeit disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged children, we actually didn't find any evidence for that at all. But if you train this complex set of skills, it requires all of that. And so we're getting these improvements in various areas. Okay. Now we've been following up on this. We've been looking at how chess playing might influence cognitive skills, doing a lot of work in this area. But we haven't yet had a chance to do brain imaging research on any of our kids. On the other hand, we have had a chance to do brain imaging and reasoning training in a set of healthy young adults. This is also work by Alison Mackey. And what we did was we were looking for an intensive reasoning training test or program that exists already. And we settled on the law school admissions test because 2/3 of this test is devoted to deductive reasoning. And students are extremely motivated because they want to get a good score on the LSAT so that they can go to a top law school. And so we identified a set of pre-law students in and around Berkeley, and half of them got 70 hours of reasoning training. Actually, it was part of a, sorry, I keep doing that. It was part of a 100 hours of class time, and 70 of those hours were focused on reasoning. And the pre-law controls went about their daily business, and we measured behavior and brain function both at the beginning and at the end of this 3-month period. And to make a long story short, these 3 months, even in the adult brain, which we tend to think of as less malleable than the child brain, we showed changes, strengthening of the reasoning network, just as a function of preparing for the law school entrance exam. And so I'm not going to go into detail here today about this, but what this image is showing are the regions within the reasoning network that showed an increase in coupling with other areas in that network. So the regions that are starting to talk more closely to other areas in the network, and you see our old friends again, the parietal and the frontal regions, that are showing greater communication. And this here is a white matter imaging study that's showing increased white matter coherence in all along the prefrontal cortex, and in the other hemisphere all along parietal cortex as well, and even between the two hemispheres. So really a pretty surprising result, and you know, very, very exciting actually. Okay, so I just want to make an interim conclusion here, and then how much time do I have left? Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap up in just a little while here, but just shortly here, I want to say that the brain is constantly changing as a function of what we experience and what we do, even throughout adulthood. IQ tests, I said I wasn't going to talk about them, but they measure the prior history of engagement of specific brain networks. So how well you do on an IQ test, we believe, based on our research, depends on how much you've been exercising this frontoparietal network in the recent past. We don't know how long of a past that has to be. We can change the strength of that connectivity within 3 months. And so you can think of, you know, at any point in time, you can measure a child's cognitive skills or an adult's cognitive skills, and it's not something fixed. Your IQ test isn't telling you if someone's smart or not smart. It's telling you how mentally fit are they, how much have they strengthened, how strong are their networks right now. Okay? So that's a really different way of thinking about the purpose of IQ tests and other kinds of standardized testing even, essentially. Just how prepared are you right now to take on this next challenge in life? All right. So an individual's potential, their future achievements, is to be determined. It can change. And I think that physical and mental exercise give children a chance to succeed. Okay. So tell me if this analogy resonates with you. We think about teaching a child something. It's like we're trying to plant a seed, and then, you know, we cover it in soil, we add some water, and then we wait, and we see what happens, and we don't know why it worked or why it didn't work. Does anybody have a sort of sense that, you know, you don't exactly know why some children understand or improve after instruction, others don't? Okay, good, thank you. What if you could peer into the soil and actually watch whether the seed is starting to sprout? And this is the work that we're engaging in right now, is trying to get an inkling as to whether some sort of instruction is actually taking root, is actually having an effect right now that we'll be able to measure later in terms of actual skills. And for this reason, we've been starting to look at eye tracking very seriously. And we use an eye tracker that's built right into a computer monitor. We take this into the schools. For example, in our chess study, we've taken it in there to measure various aspects of of children's eyes because we think that those are a window into their cognitive abilities, the strategies they're using, and potentially even how and how much they're learning. And so these are various people in my lab who are strongly engaged in this eye tracking research. And so I'm going to need to play a video here. This is essentially a very simple analogical reasoning problem. It's sort of the control condition for our analogy problems here. And so what we are asking here is which picture on the bottom goes best with the picture of the notebook on the top? Which one would you be most likely to find it with? Let me see if I can press. No, I can't do that. Can I get someone to play this video in the back? No. Okay, great, thank you. All right. All right, so we're looking at eye movements while someone is actually solving this task. You'll see those with the red. No. All right, well, never mind. Anyway, so essentially what you see is the eyes move in various places, and they finally settle on the pen. And we're using this to see, even with adults, which patterns of eye movements are most closely associated with good reasoning ability. Even in adults, they tend to, the poor reasoners tend to be engaged, distracted by things that are not actually relevant to the task at hand. All right. I'm just going to move on. Another thing that we look at is pupil dilation, just how wide your eyes are opening up. Maybe you've noticed that when you're talking to someone, if they're kind of paying close attention, their eyes widen up. And what this is it's driven by norepinephrine release in the brain. Norepinephrine is a really important chemical that supports attention in the brain. And at the same time that it's flooding the brain to allow you to perform a difficult task, it also happens to be widening your pupils. And so we can look at just how much particular information is creating an attentional demand on you. And so what we've been doing is using pupil dilation on a short-term memory task where there's way too much information to encode, and we see just where children reach their limit. So this is a digit span task where you're just staring at the computer screen, there's just a fixation cross, and you're hearing numbers, 2, 5, 1, 7, 3, 9, and you know that you're going to be tested on them later, and we see how your pupils widen, 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 up until the point where you can't take in any more new information. And in some children, then the pupils start to actually close back up. They're saying, whoa, Nellie, I can't take any more information. And what we're finding is that how much your pupils widen while you're doing this encoding actually predicts your reasoning ability. So we're having a lot of fun testing this out, and we're trying to look at whether it can predict over the long term how much you're going to learn later. And we think that this could be used in to diagnose kids who are having potentially learning difficulties. Okay. The next thing that I want to mention is that pupil dilation, we're starting to find, this is extremely new work, is revealing strategies that people are using on a reasoning problem. Really, really new work. And I won't go into the details here, but essentially, if you're doing something like the set task, and some of you know, you essentially have to look at all these different stimuli and think about how they differ from each other and how they're the same. And you see each of these one by one by one, and we're measuring how the pupils are dilating, and these different lines represent different problems that are of either easier or more difficult. And we're looking at each person's individual profile of pupil dilation while they're seeing these simple shapes and getting ready to say whether this is a set or not. And what we find is that we can tell whether someone is using a particular strategy to solve a problem, whether they're using like the better strategy or the worse strategy. And we can tell also how quickly an individual starts to figure out what are the rules of the game, and whether they even notice if a rule has been broken. So through the pupils, by looking at the pupils and whether they register surprise when a rule has been broken or whether they don't even notice when each of these stimuli is being presented. So really fun stuff that I think could be used in multiple ways. So to conclude here, getting under the hood here of the child's mind could provide us with insights that help us to refine our approaches to teaching, identify a child's individual roadblocks, develop or select appropriate methods for fixing the roadblock or for teaching children to drive around it if that's not possible. And I think there is very much a bridge here, and we can cross it. And I want to thank my lab and my funding agencies, and thank you for your time.